Welcome to the February Program Center stage. While we're waiting for everybody to make their way in from the waiting room, please take a moment to introduce yourself by putting your name, your title, the institution you work with, and where you're located into the chat. We'll give a few minutes here to get everybody settled in, and then we will go ahead and start today's program. So good afternoon for those of you who are just getting in from the waiting room. Welcome to Program Center Stage. If you don't mind, please take a few seconds to introduce yourself to everybody by putting your name, your title, what institution or organization you work for, and your location into the chat. And we got a few more folks who are rolling in here, so we'll give them a second to get settled in and connected. All right. It looks like we've got everybody in. I need to find my screens, which all have magically disappeared on me. There we go. That's what I needed. So it is my pleasure to introduce our two presenters today. Hiram LaRue is a retired USDA NIFA project manager, program manager, where he worked with international food security. And Dave Myers, who currently serves as an agricultural extension educator with the University of Maryland at Anne Arundel and Prince George's counties. And I will be posting their full bios into the chat here in a moment. And so with that, I will turn the floor over to Hiram and Dave. Hiram.
Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of this. Before we even though begin the beginnings, let's enter this session in a little bit different kind of way by having Dave Myers, my co-presenter here, read a poem by the well-known American poet Marge Piercy. This piece describes a personal experience that the poet had with hunger, and it appeared in a 2013 issue of the journal called Word Soup. It's titled Statistics Don't Talk Loud Enough. Dave, if you could read this poem for us, that would be great.
My pleasure, Hiram. Millions of families with children face hunger. Bureaucrats call it food insecure. I call it pain. I remember when we had only beans and potatoes in the house. I remember 3 weeks of oatmeal for every meal, but at last we had something to fill our bellies. Over a vacation in college, I was broke, made a stew. By the 4th day, I was eating water and flour. People fast voluntarily for health, religion, but hunger eats you from the inside. After a while, it's all you think. You want to sleep. You don't care what teachers say. You're hollow, empty of all but hurt. Thanks for that opportunity. What a great poem from Marge.
Thank you, Dave. That is a wonderful poem. In fact, I would say this poem is really haunting. And as maybe everyone noticed, it uses very clear, direct language, not what we might call poetic language, to tell a story as remembered by someone who was hungry and then was lucky enough to escape hunger. Dave, I think we can go to the next slide. So as we start, let me pause for a minute and thank Jason Weigel and Melanie Pugsley and Molly Ibbendorf of the Extension Foundation for being brave enough to host this webinar on, yes, an unusual topic. And my special thanks to Dave Myers of the University of Maryland's Anne Arundel County Extension Team for working with me to present the webinar today. And lastly, of course, a mega thanks to all of you who are joining the webinar today. I hope you'll find it useful as you design and offer extension programs. So right at the outset, let me acknowledge that poetry, yes, poetry seems galaxies away from day-to-day extension activities. Indeed, you could reasonably ask, what in the world could poetry ever offer extension staff who work with programs and stakeholders involved in food production, nutrition efforts, or youth development? It turns out that I strongly believe, and I think it's true, that poetry can, in fact, can be very useful if you're wanting to really involve your audience and even touch hearts in powerful ways. Right alongside all of the science, all of the trend lines, all of the data and statistics that you present, poetry can bring fresh air into the room and, trust me, can grab the imagination of those who might not otherwise engage. So if you're skeptical or curious, then hang in there with me and let's keep going. The purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate how poetry can be used and is already being used to help deliver messages about at least one important agricultural issue, namely local and global hunger. But here's the key point. Hunger is just one example, an example that illustrates the broader point, namely that poetry can be useful when discussing a wide variety of extension topics. Poetry can help you to capture your audience's attention, be they kids, seniors, farmers, business people, community activists, you name it. Said slightly differently, by the end of this webinar, I hope that you'll be asking yourself how poetry could serve your extension programming needs. Also, at the outset, let's be very clear and very realistic. Poetry is magical, yes, indeed, but it rarely solves problems like bringing hunger to an end. Having said that, it's also true that poetry can and does help. When used as a tool for teaching or workshopping or training, it can be a powerful way for you to break through with elders or youth, urban, suburban, or rural residents, so that they more fully enjoy learning. So let's get started. Again, we'll use poetry about hunger as the illustrative example. And by the way, the little painting up in the right-hand corner of each of our slides is artwork, the logo for PoetryxHunger, which I'll describe here in a few minutes, by the artist and poet Diane Wilbon Parks. So let's move to the next slide. Hunger has been a scourge of humanity forever. And for probably as long, poetry has been written about hunger. Here's a remarkably quiet, and for that reason, powerful piece by the haiku master Matsu Basho, who lived nearly 500 years ago, from 1644 to 1694. Note how just in a few words, this poet, living almost 4 centuries ago, conveys a haunting story of want without ever using the word hunger. For this lovely bowl, let us arrange some flowers, since we have no rice. Trust me when I say that similarly moving poems have been written about hunger or famine in China, Africa, the Great Hunger Famine, Irish Potato Famine in Ireland, and more poems are being written about hunger in America. We can move to the next slide. Hunger isn't just historical. It certainly has historical dimensions, but it exists among us today. In fact, while lots of progress had been made through agricultural breakthroughs in food production, storage, marketing, and the like, hunger is all too present around the world. COVID, conflict, environmental issues have not helped. And around the world includes hunger here in the US on many of our street corners in America. Here's just some data that might be helpful in clarifying. Today, between 1 and 2 billion people globally are food insecure or hungry. That's out of a total of about 7 to 8 billion folks living on this planet. Famines in Zimbabwe not too long ago were in the headlines. At least 5 million people in that Southern African country faced starvation and still are threatened by it. And recently, of course, relief agencies like the Red Cross and Feed the Children have been scrambling to assess and respond to COVID-related increase in world hunger. Closer to home, the August 24, 2020 issue of Barron's magazine indicated that 20% of Americans with children say that they can't get enough food, and that was up from about 17% just a few months earlier. Other reports indicate that at least 15%, 15% of American households are hungry. And here's one that really, really rattles me. 1 in 5 college students in the US report being hungry. Hunger has many causes and just as many impacts. And while it is simple and powerfully clear in how it manifests, it's very complicated at its roots. And of course, that makes it incredibly hard to fight, much less to eradicate. And so it's not surprising that as poets have picked up their pencils, pens, or keyboards to write about hunger, they start writing about the many facets and causes of hunger. The important point, though, is this. Yes, we need all the numbers, all the data about hunger and any other ag-related issue in order to address it, understand it through science and policy development and legislation. But sometimes those numbers just don't break through to public understanding or grab the hearts and minds of public members. Numbers often don't change behaviors or move people to action. As I mentioned, poets are beginning to write about many of hunger's facets. Here's a poem that we'll play back for you by Sylvia Diane Lady Di Beverly about one aspect of hunger titled, the poem is titled Pitch In, and this poem is all about the issue of food waste. Dave will scroll down through the text of the poem, and then down at the base here is a video of Lady Di performing her poem.
People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. Her meals were from partially eaten sandwiches thrown in public trash cans. She watched a child throw away a sandwich, one bite out of it. Getting sandwich from can immediately would be her evening meal. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. An apple, a pear, a peach, some cherries, some grapes, to help provide nutrition, to help curb appetite, praying to God above, never to give up ferocious fight. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. A project for many years, helping my mother make sandwiches in our kitchen for family and friends. Taking sandwiches to organizations like SOME, so others might eat. Brains on, cheers, chants, yay, food is here. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. Standing on Main Avenue in freezing cold and snow, holding signs saying, help me feed my children, if only for one night. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. All across the world, people die from hunger and malnutrition. To ignore this plight would be a ridiculous, selfish shame. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food. What can you do? What can I do? What can others do to help end this international plague? The answer is blowing in the wind, doing something consistent we can all pitch in. People are hungry, yet people continue to waste food.
Thank you, Dave. That was a poem by Lady Di Beverly. She lives in suburban Maryland outside of DC. The title of that poem was Pitch In, and it illustrates, I think, some of the grab that these types of poems bring with them. So the next slide then, in response to the growing incidence of hunger, poets of all ages are beginning to use their poetry and their poetic talents to weigh in. Poetry is a powerful, engaging way to make a point or to raise a question, and the poet has lots of tools at her or his disposal. Poets often pull all the stops. They'll use format, rhythm, rhyme, meter, font, and all kinds of language, formal language, slang, rural dialects, lingo, even street smart saltiness as they share their poems' messages. They also use many platforms. Poems about hunger are being presented over the webs, on blogs, in journals and magazines, on placards. I even saw one the other day on a bag and the like. So many platforms for presenting the poems. And poets use all sorts of modes of delivery. They use rap, slam, spoken word performance, or traditional printed text on a page to present their poems. If they recite their poems, they'll often use volume, inflection, diction, pacing, gesturing, and body movement to reinforce the poem's impact. And sometimes, if we're all lucky, the audience is all lucky, the poet will even have memorized the poem and perform their poem. And of course, both written and performed pieces can be shared widely through social media. YouTube, for example, has lots of videos of poets presenting their work. Let's go to the next slide, Dave. Thank you. I'd like to use this slide, if you will, to introduce another example of a recorded presentation of a hunger poem. In this case, this 3-minute poem is an award-winning one, hunger poem that is performed by Aaron R. of Arlington, Virginia, and is titled Hunger Pains.
When I started my business
Hunger Pains by Aaron R.
First prize winner. In a world that's concerned with the economy and marketing numbers, how do we have people out here starving and dealing with hunger? We've come too far as nations to be facing this situation. So we have a plan in 2030 as our destination. And I'm not talking about decreasing, I'm talking about elimination. So we don't have anybody starving in any nation. Speaking of nations, it's kind of strange to me that in this land of plenty of opportunity, there's people walking down the street without food to eat. We spend millions of dollars on entertainment, but that's another topic. There's people out here starving. We need to do something to stop it. We spend money on war, but we need to be at war with not feeding the poor. This is a situation we can no longer ignore. I mean, families with children walking around with their stomachs growling and sore. We owe it to each other to do so much more, so let's depend on each other and help one another. In order to stop world hunger, the world's gonna need one another. So my challenge to you and my challenge to me, do something small or large or independently, because together everyone achieves more. If we unite as a team, world hunger will be no more. We can achieve this dream. That sounds like a plan that's worth it to me. So let's all embark on this journey and do little by little, day by day, until 2030, and stop the hunger pains that stain our society. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave.
Just give me a minute here. Harm.
Yeah, sure. So as you could probably tell, Aaron was performing that piece by memory and in front of very...
So the poem I have for you is titled Conscience. And it talks about climate change and the vices that fester on our community.
There we go. And Aaron's poem, as I said, was memorized and was presented in front of several different food-focused meetings and conferences. That poem, in fact, won the 2018 World Food Day poetry competition that was sponsored by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in concert with PoetryxHunger. Yes, indeed, running a competition for poets to write hunger or water or agricultural focused poetry is a great way to enlist a community's creativity. And as you watch that clip, I hope you are asking yourself, how could a presentation like his impact some of your program and be useful to you in your work as you program opportunities and presentations about food security, hunger, and the like. So we can go to the next slide. Yeah, thanks, Dave. So, okay, let's say you're interested, hopefully interested in using poetry in an upcoming workshop or a lesson plan. What should you do? How do you get started? Well, first off, don't be daunted. A lot of people are put off by poetry as an unknown and maybe even unfriendly world. Don't be daunted. It's actually pretty easy to find a poem that you will like, a poem or two on most any topic using Google, that all-knowing Google. It's also pretty easy to encourage classrooms and workshop participants to write a short poem about, in this case, hunger or a topic of your liking. And while a personal experience with the topic such as hunger, gardening, growing up, financial planning, makes it easier for somebody to write about that topic, those who don't have relevant experience can still write something about the chosen topic. For example, people often say, oh, well, you've never been hungry, LaRue. You can't write about hunger. I disagree. I can't write about it with the authenticity of somebody like Miss Piercy, who wrote that poem that Dave read at the beginning. But I can write with questions in mind about, well, I'm not hungry. Why are you? What is the difference? Where are the inequities? What's broken down that allows you to be hungry when I'm not? So I think there are ways that all of us can contribute a poem on any topic that might be useful. So the key point here is there are findable poems on many, many extension topics, and there are poems inside all of us. So let's look at some resources. The web represents a treasure trove of resources, and it's typically fairly fast and easy to track down information on poems about a certain topic. If you just say poem about X, you'll get quite a few poems come up. You can also look for poems for certain age groups, and you can even look for how to present a poem or how to start writing a poem. There's information about all of that on the web. Here's just one example of a resource. If you are, in fact, interested on poems about Hungary, you'll probably run into a website as you search that I worked to develop with help from the Maryland State Arts Council and many others, called PoetryxHunger. On that site, you'll find many, I think at last count, we were between 300 and 400 poems by adults and young people, by Americans, Pakistani, Irish, Australian, African poets, so poets from near and far, that are all freely available to you for you to use. All of the poems are presented, of course, as text, and many of them are offered as audio or video recordings with the poet presenting their work. All you have to do is go to, there's the website, PoetryxHunger.com. I would encourage you at some point in your copious free time to check out the poem there by a woman named Patience, like being patient, Patience Gumbo, Gumbo, of Zimbabwe. It's only an audio recording, but it is a very haunting poem titled Hunger. The website also includes links to hunger organizations and studies, historical accounts of hunger that may evoke a poem by those who read those accounts. It also includes a special section that I'd like to build out a bit more called Young, ! Where several poems by young people are posted. And everything is searchable on the site. It's freely available for your use. There are other resources that are available. These include poets in your neighborhood. Believe it or not, you have poets in your neighborhood. You may not know them, but they're there. I guarantee you they are there. Faculty or students on campus write poems. There are poetry circles in your community, or certainly in your state. And more, there are poet laureates available from your own town or state. And in their role, they promote awareness and use of poetry. We've just established in the county Dave and I live in, Anne Arundel County, a poet laureate or poet in residence, I think we're calling her, for the Anne Arundel County Food Bank. And she's writing about their programs. She's writing poems that they can use in their meetings and fundraisers about their programs. And if you should ever really want to pursue some activity that involves poetry, but in order to do so, you need grant support to do it, your local arts council may be interested in partnering with you. They've been very forthcoming and helpful as I've reached out and branched out into this area.
And Hiram, before we move on, I just want to add that Hiram's also a poet laureate who has inspired me to become a better poet and to become engaged in this community that I was unaware of. And so I just want to thank you, Hiram, for that. I know it's been a real pleasure, having you as a mentor, as a poet mentor.
Well,
and I want to thank you.
Well, goodness, Dave, if I'm mentoring you, then I can be very, very proud because I think you don't need any mentoring. Dave is just such a remarkable extension leader, and you're going to hear from him in just a moment about some of the things he does to use what I call kind of poetic language to offer his clients and community. The only other point I would make about grants would be that at some point, and I can say this because I'm retired from USDA in a grants making agency part of USDA, I would hope that USDA granting agencies like NIFA will at some point tune in and support this kind of bringing the creative arts, including poetry, into agricultural classrooms and programs. So we're getting towards the end here. Let's move to the next slide, Dave. Here are some ways to include poetry in your programming. You can open or close a workshop, like we're doing today, your classroom or a meeting with a poem. You can read a poem to the audience, or along with the audience recite it, or ask a volunteer on the spot to read the poem. You can play a recording back, a video or audio recording of a poet presenting his or her work. Or you could ask a participant to come prepared to present a poem to the group. You could also ask students or workshoppers to find a poem beforehand on their own that's relevant to the topic, and then have the finders read those poems aloud. Have participants discuss the features of the poem that enhance or detract from its message. So dive a little bit into the poem. You can also encourage participants to write for 10 minutes. Take a time out during a meeting and write for 5 to 10 minutes about a particular topic that's being discussed, and then allow enough time for a few of them to share what they write, the beginnings of a poem. Trust me, people love doing that. Expect everything when you ask for that kind of response, expect everything from a mumbled, non-poetic line or two to a full-blown sonnet. I've had people within 5 minutes come up with a sonnet. It's amazing. With needed permissions, you can post participants' poems on a board or a site or elsewhere where they can be admired and where the poet can be very proud of what's been posted. You can host a contest around a theme and then, of course, celebrate the winners. And if you're interested in more info on how to bring poetry into the classroom, discussion of food, agriculture, nutrition, youth development, you might want to tune into Penn State University's Global Ag Learning, GLAG, G-L-A-G, community. An aspect of this important initiative focuses on, you got it, using poetry and other arts in formal and non-formal classroom discussions of agriculture and related topics. Again, that's Pennsylvania State University's Global Ag Learning Community, GLAG. The next to last slide has Dave coming on mic for sure. This presentation has singled out hunger as a topic for involving poets. And so I want you folks to think then about how you could suggest topics or think about topics that make sense to you and ways then that poetry might be useful in presenting your work or your thoughts or your presentation. The first bullet here is using poetry or poetry-like text in outreach and newsletters. And Dave's got a wonderful example from his own work that he wants to share with us.
Thank you, Harlan. Let me switch over the page view here. And what I want to share with you is the some documents that I have worked with my clientele. And so what I have done is I've opened up my newsletter every month now for 22 and a half years. I was just looking, I've accumulated 89 rambles that I take kind of a literary license and sometimes a little bit poetic to kind of reel in my community, to engage them in a way that's not just scientific. I'm an agronomist and weed scientist, and I can be pretty scientific and pretty dry, right? Like most scientists. But I think a lot of people will open my newsletter mainly because I put this little ramble in the beginning of each one. I want to read you the one that I just produced here on my last quarter newsletter, Winter 2023. And it reads, I am convinced, and in the voice, I have to admit that I take on the voice of the crops master when I write to my ramble. And because it was a previous position I held at the U.S. Naval Academy Dairy. And so in this position, then, I take on this voice to engage my farm community. I am convinced no matter how hard it becomes, someone will farm, declares the crops master. We are told of more tempest with frequent floods and sinister heat waves with deeper droughts, all fraught with pestilence be our looming future. Our heads hang low at the cost of fuel and fertilizer. Forced upon us for mere survival are the use of unnatural genetics and man-made pesticides poured upon our soils of exhaustion. Feeble old tractors awaiting parts from the idle factories further burdens the bent backs and slow-to-move shoulders. Even the supposedly warmer winters are vengeful with snowmageddons and bomb cyclones. The bells' disturbing clang, unceasingly louder, a message of woe to our farmers. Harder times are yet to come. Expect the worst and you will never be disappointed, reminded the crops master. I believe that most farmers spend time healing in the winter, knowing of the travail to come. They will buy their fertilizer and their fuel, their seed, their pest control products, equipments, and parts, and with a very sharp pencil plan to use each input as sparingly as possible. And when spring returns, just like every year before and after, with zeal even, the farmers will farm. The farmers will fret about the late frost and the early heat and the too wet or too dry conditions, but still find time for a lighthearted chuckle at the morning shop gathering. Time will be found to repair the equipment as needed, provide instruction to the new farmhand, and feed the cows, as if the world's tales of woe were meaningless. Hear this, my friends of woe, it will never become too hard for a farmer to farm. I use such literary license in prose and maybe even a little bit of cynicism and sarcasm and to kind of put us in the moment and all to tie our hearts together. And a lot of times, and I've done this now for 22 and a half years, every quarter, haven't missed a quarter. And I know my farm community loves it.
Well, for 22 years, you've been offering wonderful, what we might call prose poems, Dave, to your audience, your readership. The message here, that line, the farmers will farm in spite of everything. Wonderful, wonderful piece. So that's a perfect example and an illustration of one way that a poem or poetic language can be included and help, as Dave just said, capture your audience.
And soon, Hiram, I'll have 100 of them. I'll have 2.5 more years. I'll have 100.
You'll have to have a book.
And what's really amazing is when you go back, it's a time capsule. Each quarter, you had that connectivity back to that community at the time that you did that, and it's a amazing reminiscence of things done.
We're going to look forward to the book of those where you've compiled them all, Dave.
Now, another point I want to make, Hiram, is when you spoke of Patience Gumbo, I share that poem with my students every semester. I teach a course at University of Maryland on pesticide use and safety. And you think, well, how does poetry tie to pesticide use and safety? But it does tie. It ties to every facet of agriculture when we think about hunger and patience. I let it ring true that, even the aspects of pesticide use has increased our agricultural output. Sure. And so thereby is tied into that. And to hear Patience Gumbo's haunting words, like you say, read her poem, Hunger, it spellbounds me every time I hear it.
It does me as well.
Yeah, it's incredible. So make sure you hear that one. That's absolutely fantastic.
Great.
The other one that, as we go down this list here of other opportunities besides newsletters, I just want to.
And Dave, also, could we move to the? I'm sorry, you're right.
Yeah, presentations. Yep. Go ahead and carry on, but make sure if we had time, that IPM Phyto Poetry Project by Iowa State University is absolutely fabulous. So I don't know if we'll have time to go see that or not, but that's another one besides Patience Gumbo, is to go make sure you look at the Phyto Poetry Project at Iowa State.
Yes, Dave pointed this out to me. It's a great initiative headed up by folks at Iowa State. And it's all about kind of IPM and poetry. It's amazing. So just Google the Phyto Poetry Project at Iowa State University, and it'll pop right up. A gentleman with an amazing, I think it's artificial, huge mustache will pop up. A picture of him will pop up on that. And there are just a few other ideas here about other topics where poems could perhaps be used. Everything from pollinators to farm labor. Let's move on to the final slide then, Dave. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. I hope you have found this fairly useful and that you will have some questions or reactions that you'll be willing to share with us here in just a moment. But before we go, we opened with a poem and I want to close with a poem. And so, David, if you can stop share screening, I'll toggle in here and see if I can pull up. Give me just 1 second. Pull up a poem that, again, I find incredibly moving because it comes from, again, one never wants to assume that a poem has been written as a personal testimony or as a personal account of what the poet has experienced. Poet might take wing and want to kind of interpret what somebody else is feeling. But in this case, I think it's fairly safe to say that this poem written by Brian Donald James of Reston, Virginia, which, by the way, won the 2020 World Food Day Poetry Prize, is written from personal experience. Now, you may need to turn up the volume of your computer. Like Lady Di's poem, Brian recorded this outdoors, and there's a little bit of ambient noise in the background, and you don't want to miss a word of this, trust me. Let me see if I can expand it. Yeah, there we go. And then here is Brian Donnell James reading his poem, Testimony.
Good evening. My name is Brian Donald James, and I'm the 2020 winner of the World Food Day Poetry Competition. I would like to share my poem, Testimony, with you. Testimony. I was a teenage father then, with little money. My wife and I had saved our lunch so that our son could eat. And we went without a meal that day. As night approached, we had hoped that he would sleep until morning. And with every twist and turn he made, my anxiety rose and fell. But as toddlers do, he rose hungry, rubbing circles on his belly. He was trying to be a big boy, trying to control the desperation I saw in his eyes. I nodded to my wife, and we gathered change from everywhere, anywhere, between cushions and under couches, closets, desk, and cabinet drawers. And I was off to shop with newly found pocket change. Enough for some instant noodles, Kool-Aid, bread, and peanut butter. Even as I counted out the change and people in line smirked and commented, the cashier and I knew I didn't have enough. My eyes swelled, and I tried to control my desperation. She smiled and said, "Well, that's just enough." I bagged my food and I left. Walking back to our little apartment, I would never forget that feeling. Emotion overcame me. Not embarrassment or shame, just thankfulness, just love. I'll do anything for my boy. Thank you.
So that was Brian Donald James in his poem, reading his poem, Testimony. All of the poems that we presented today are available on the PoetryxHunger website. And I believe, Jason, you'll be sending out both the recording of this session and then the PowerPoints as well. And the links to the poems will also be in the PowerPoints. So again, my deep, deep thanks to Dave Myers for joining me in this venture, and to all of you for being here. And I think at this point, Dave, if you have any thoughts or comments, but we'll maybe turn it over to Jason.
Okay, just one thing. I just want to thank everyone for being here today and take advantage of working poetry into your extension life. I think that you'll find it's very rewarding, very powerful, and very engaging. And sometimes it takes the scientific nature that we typically bring to people in extension a little bit further, and a little bit, like I say, deeper into somebody's appreciation and heart. So I echo Hiram, and I wish that we kind of would see funding come down for a little bit more of the creative arts coming into extension. I think that's probably a great idea. And maybe we're the drivers of that, right? We're the ones that have that conversation. So I'd encourage you to do that. And I want to thank Hiram too, because like I say, he's a great mentor for poetry, and the work that he's done with the Hunger X poetry project, PoetryxHunger project is excellent. And they do have a competition, and I have encouraged my students to take, even my farmers, to engage in that competition. So a lot to take in when it comes to the use of poetry. So thanks again, everyone, for coming. And Jason, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Hiram and Dave. Thank you for a great presentation and for all the feedback that you've been getting. Just wanted to point it out, the feedback in the chat. So everybody seems to really appreciated the session that you put on this afternoon. So we do have a bit of time left. So at this point, I'd open the floor up to questions. Well, I'll get us started because I do have a question.
Sure.
So Dave, you mentioned using hunger at your pesticide trainings, and I had a chance to read through it as I was frantically trying to find the link for it. So in request or response to one of the requests in the chat. So what is generally the response that you get back from participants in your pesticide training courses whenever you do that?
Well, that's really good. I think most of them will find that they appreciate bringing that hunger into it and bringing different perspective. I do tend to bring a lot of philosophies in when I teach, so it's not just science. And I think when it comes to these issues around agriculture, there's a lot of things in ethical, moral. There's a lot of things we have to discuss when it comes to the use of science appropriately. And so again, I've taught in 13 different countries, and I've taken students abroad to Africa, Liberia, and into Uganda, and having seen all the different situations of agriculture in the world, farmers aren't much different, which is what I find. And they're trying to make choices about technology and trying to find the most appropriate technology to deal with the issues they have. And I think that's a big responsibility that we have. And I hope that I teach my students in that way. And we use all the scientific tools. And when we have to engage with different communities, we need to know cultures, and we need to know poetry. We need to know arts and all those other things to engage them. I remember going to Uganda and listening to the Ugandan and Burundi drummers. And I'm thinking, wow, that's just that's an experience you just don't get. You know, diving into other cultures and trying to understand them better.
And, you know, seeing Victor and his background there with all the musical instruments, it looks like, especially guitars, makes the key point that poetry is just one of the arts, of course. Music and song, dance, theater, visual arts can all be used in service to extension programming. We just kind of talked about one, I think an important one, but just one art today, the written art of poetry.
Back when they were doing the kind of the flash mobs where you would kind of come together very quickly, I did a forage trial flash mob and just went out and see who could come, and just sent it out early in the morning and said, you know, we're going to have this kind of flash mob at the forage trial. And I said, of course, when you do something like that, my assistant said that, well, you have to sing a song or do a dance if you're going to do it correctly. So when we got there, I made the farmers sing John Denver's song, and they were reluctant at first, but they finally handed out the music sheet, and we're going to sing this song, and we all sang it. And so, you know, it just changes the dynamic of learning.
I'll never forget, I was in a meeting of food security experts. Now, some of them were extension specialists and leaders, others were scientists, but they all were very comfortable talking about the science and the trends in food security, an international meeting. And I had invited Aaron R., who presented that poem, Hunger, about hunger pains, to recite in front of it.
Yep.
When he stepped up, people weren't really sure what this was all about. They had introduced him as a poet, and this group had never, ever heard a poet before. By the time he finished, I stood back and watched him being mobbed, because I think he connected with folks in ways that we simply hadn't connected with each other before at this meeting, at this kind of meeting. So like you were saying, Dave, I think it can be, the arts and poetry specifically can be used in surprising ways. So I encourage you all to test it out and try it. And I apologize, I haven't been watching the chat. I simply haven't had a chance to, but if there are questions there or things that Dave or I could help with, we promise we'll get back. If Jason, I think I can save the chat, but certainly Jason, if you or Melanie could save the chat, we promise, threaten to get back to you if you have any questions that you've raised there. Are there any questions in the chat, Jason, that or any comments?
There was a couple comments. I need to scroll way back up. Donna Guerin talked about launching a project that she's working on in March that
Yes.
Hiram will be part of, and provided a link, which hopefully several people said thank you, and hopefully we'll be part of that.
And she has like classroom teachers from literally all over the world participating in that. So it's going to be truly a UN, a United Nations of a conference. So I would encourage you folks to tune in.
Excellent. And then Melanie and I were scrambling to grab as many of the links that you mentioned and websites as you mentioned as we could. So we
Thanks.
put a bunch of those into the chat, and we will, as you mentioned, Hiram, we'll be putting these into our follow-up email and sending them out to everybody who's registered as well.
Great.
And then Pam Watson talked about appreciating this presentation after attending this weekend's tuning in over the internet to this weekend's Fisher's Poetry Gathering in Astoria, Oregon.
Oh, cool.
Cool. Very nice.
And so, and then there's a whole lot of thank yous and great jobs.
Okay. Well, good.
And then Victor, Victor will be doing a program center stage in September, focused around music and puppetry for Latino outreach and education. I'm looking forward to that. I think that's going to be a lot of fun.
That'd be great.
So a little plug for that. A few months down the road, but for our program center stage, it's upcoming.
Wonderful.
And then, okay, Pam just put a bit more about the Fisher's Poetry Gathering into the chat.
Great. I'm not familiar with that group, so that'll be fun for me to learn about. Yeah, I was going to say something else here. Oh, well, I know I cannot offer Dave's help. I know he's a very helpful guy, but I also know he's very busy. But if any of you folks would like to have somebody kind of at your side or behind you, backing you up, as you explore the notion of using poems in some of your outreach efforts, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help, because I learn a lot in working alongside experts like yourself. And I would love to, for example, work with a 4-H leader or a family and consumer science leader as they reach out to the community and or young people and use maybe a poem or two in the programs. I'd love to learn about how that's done. So please feel free to reach out to me. My email was in the, and Dave's too, was in the last slide. We'll make sure that you have that email, those emails.
Yep, we will make sure that they are in the email or in the follow-up email that comes along afterwards.
I know I have one final thing. When I think of the arts and poetry, sometimes we get weighed down with a lot of pessimism. And I think somehow the arts and poetry gives more optimism, I think. And so I always tell my students, if you're pessimistic about the future and you're not even 30 yet, you've got troubles. And so anything that you can do to become more optimistic about the future, you know, let the pessimists, let them be about 80, 90 or whatever, however old they are. Let's let the optimists be our young. And so I think we have to engage more, I think, in the arts in order to have this optimism prevail.
Yep.
The heavy science brings us down.
That's a great point, Dave.
Yep.
And my last comment will be this. It's kind of apropos, maybe nothing that we've talked about today, but I'm so proud of the fact that we have recently proven that poetry can help not only enlarge or expand on and grab people, enlarge their thinking and grab people's hearts and minds, but we've also proven that poems can raise money to fight hunger. We've recently raised more than $5,000 at a reading auction where artists painted to a poem about hunger from the website. And then we auctioned that artwork and we raised more than $5,000 for Feed the Children. And then right after that, we had a simple poetry reading where poets spoke about hunger, and we raised more than $1,000 for a food bank in the greater DC area. So the point is, poems can be used to actually raise support for these different causes. And like I said, I'm very proud of that. Christy, there is a curriculum on introducing poetry to the classroom on the GLAG, Global Learning in Agriculture website or platform. If you have problems finding it, reach out to me and I can share it with you.
All right. Any final questions for our two presenters today?
Well, thanks everyone for being here.
Yes.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you to everyone, and thank you to our presenters. Just a few final comments, and then we'll be able to head home for the day. So I had popped into the chat earlier, and I'll put it in here again. If you would, please take a few seconds to fill out our 1-minute feedback form. We'll also include a link to it in the follow-up email. So if you aren't able to do it today, please do take a moment to do it, because it helps us and the presenters know what we can do better. And it gives us new ideas for programs to integrate into Program Center Stage and our other professional development opportunities, which gives me a segue to our professional development opportunities website, which I also popped into the chat. So beyond Program Center Stage, we also have two others. We have Dynamic Discussions, which is a hot topic discussion forum. And then we also have Extension Skills, where our presenters help to expand all of our capacity to do the work that we do within the extension system. And so please feel free to click the link and go to that site and take a look at the other offerings that we have. I know several of you take advantage of those already. So if you haven't, please take a moment to take a look at that. And then finally, next month's Program Center Stage is going to be the Extension Foundation's Aaron Wybe, talking about the Foundation's tools and resources that are available for land-grant universities. There are a whole lot of tools and resources available, many of which even I, as a employee of the Foundation, learn about on a day-to-day basis. So please do, if you are interested in learning about some of the things that we offer as a service to you, please feel free to stop in at next month's Program Center Stage session on March 27th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And so with that, thank you all again for your attendance today. And thank you again to Hiram and Dave for the excellent presentation. And enjoy the rest of the afternoon, everybody.
Jason, did you want to stay on for just a minute, or
Yes.
do you have to